Today, Buffalo Trace quietly produces finely crafted bourbon. Yet more than 200 years ago, on this very site, legends such as Daniel Boone, George Rogers Clark braved frontier dangers to find new lands and new adventures. In 1775, brothers Hancock and Winnis Lee established the settlement of Leestown with a small company of men. Leestown was the Commonwealth's first settlement north of the Kentucky River, and the Lees group struggled to survive in a wilderness that was as rugged as their souls. In 1776, Indian raids coupled with the advent of the American Revolution nearly extinguished the settlement forever, but the Buffalo Trace continued to bring pioneers westward. By 1789, the ancient Buffalo Crossing was bustling with activity as Leestown became a key stop along the Buffalo Trace in the Kentucky River. Brisk traffic and distilled spirits had begun, and Leestown's warehouses stored many a barrel of Kentucky's finest whiskey. Soon a distillery was built on the site, thus making the beginning of what we know as the Buffalo Trace's long history in pioneering and innovation as the leader in the bourbon history. The first modern distillery was built here in 1857. It was the first US distillery to incorporate the use of steam power, a major advancement in producing high-quality whiskey. The distillery was later purchased and further modernized by E.H. Taylor Jr., known as one of Kentucky's original bourbon aristocrats. Taylor was an industry leader who greatly advanced the quality of Kentucky's bourbon and safeguarded the bourbon label from bogus producers. By 1886, the distillery had introduced the nation's first climate-controlled warehousing for aging whiskey and was known around the world for producing America's finest spirits. The distillery remained a top producer well into the 1900s, but was threatened when Prohibition was enacted in 1920. Fortunately, it was one of the 4 distilleries in Kentucky to continue distillation during Prohibition. With a government permit, the distillery was allowed to produce limited bottling of whiskey for medicinal purposes, helping to keep its doors open until repeal in 1933. Despite the setbacks of Prohibition and the Great Flood of 1937, the distillery rebounded and flourished under the guidance of Colonel Albert B. Blanton. Blanton was a bourbon aristocrat in the mold of E.H. Taylor and the great whiskey man of the 1800s. Blanton was born and raised on a farm adjacent to the distillery and was a bourbon traditionalist at heart. For himself and a few select friends, he occasionally produced and bottled a single barrel bourbon, much the same way as Kentucky's earliest bourbon pioneers. In 1984, in honor of the Colonel and his love for tradition, the distillery made history with the world's first single barrel bourbon to be commercially marketed.